Jackie, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good. We are doing this a little bit differently today because we're obviously in the same room if you're watching this on YouTube. So Jackie came up to my house for the week and we are recording some podcasts up here. And so this is really fun to be in the same room with each other.
Yeah, it is.
Doing this
on split screen.
Right. Right. So this is really cool.
This is cool.
Today, I think we're going to do a little discussion or a chat about sourdough again. So we're calling this sourdough round 2.
Love it.
And the main reason is because, first of all, we both like to talk about sourdough, right?
Just a little wee bit.
Second of all, the first time we talked about sourdough, as I was editing it, I realized that I dominated the conversation.
Just tells you how passionate we are about sourdough.
Yes, and I didn't really let Jackie have a chance to talk. So this is Jackie's interpretation of sourdough. Just kidding. We're still going to chat and share with each other, but I wanted to hear her perspective on her experiences with sourdough. So that's what we're doing today.
I think that sounds fun, and I don't really know where we're going to go with this, but
yeah.
Sourdough is so much fun. I don't know why I feel so much joy about sourdough, but I do. I really, really do. It's so much fun to take flour and water and salt, and that's literally all that's in a basic sourdough loaf. You can add more ingredients, obviously, but there's so much joy in just taking those 3 ingredients and turning it into this loaf of bread that is so, knowing what I know about sourdough, it's so nourishing for my body, and my body can handle digesting it a lot better than other breads. And I mean, I didn't love the flavor of sourdough, I think, growing up, but I do now. And so it's just all those things combined, and it's just a really joyful thing for me when I'm kind of bored on the weekend or leading up to the weekend. I'm like, what am I going to do? I'm like, I know, I'm going to make sourdough. That's my go-to. So that tells you how much I love it.
Your entertainment of choice.
Yes, my entertainment of choice. Just kidding. One of my choices of entertainment. No, I've been on a fun journey, I think, with sourdough. I've probably been how long have I been making sourdough? A couple of years? Probably a couple of years. And anytime that you're doing something for a couple of years, right, whether it's taking care of chickens or raising children or making sourdough, you kind of figure things out after a couple of years, right, of doing it somewhat consistently. And so I feel like that's kind of where I'm at with the sourdough. At the beginning, it was the sourdough starter. If you want more details about creating a sourdough starter and the actual kind of logistics, go watch our other sourdough video. We kind of got into some of those things in the other one. That was a really great video and episode. But I think I wanted to talk a little bit more about the nuances, right, and some of the fun things that we've learned along our journeys, and what we learned, and what goes really well, what doesn't go so well.
Sure.
At the beginning, I think I was just I don't remember even how I got introduced to sourdough. I was learning about all things cultured and fermented kind of all at once. And sourdough was included. And so I think I got a sourdough starter from somebody, and I was trying to figure out how to keep it alive. And I did that successfully for a bit. And then I think I ignored it for long enough, and I think it eventually died is what happened. I think I would have looked now what I know, I could have revived it pretty easily.
Sure.
But I didn't know what I didn't know at that time. And it died. So I threw the whole thing away. And I also remember at the beginning stage, maybe I'll call this phase 1 of sourdough production, right? All the learning curves and all the things, and you don't know what you don't know because you're like, this is brand new and I have no idea what I'm doing. Even though you have the instructions and the tools, right? But I remember being so overwhelmed with the sourdough discard, which is every day or however often you're feeding your sourdough with more fresh flour and water, you have to remove some of the already the sourdough starter that's already in your jar, so that you have a smaller amount that needs to get fed. And then it's what do you do with all that extra? Right. And one website or one person that I was listening to said, just throw it away, just throw it down your food disposal. And I was like, excuse me?
But when you're using good, organic, expensive flour,
that was my issue.
You're I'm dumping money down the drain.
I know. That was really my biggest issue. I was like, I am paying $5 for package of flour,
Mhm.
and I'm going through this package, within 2
Pretty
or 3
quick.
weeks
Yeah.
of feeding the sourdough starter. So I'm like, I'm just throwing $5 down the drain every 2 weeks. I don't like that. So that was really kind of one of my bigger issues, aside from learning how to keep my sourdough starter alive,
Sure.
which took me a minute to figure out, but we'll circle back to that one in a minute. But yeah, no, I figured out some really fun ways. Anyway, there's this, and then this whole world opened up of like what to do with your sourdough discard. And that has been really beautiful because I didn't understand enough about the, like, how do I say this, right? Like when you're feeding your sourdough starter over a 12-hour period of time, roughly 12-hour period of time, it gets really big. Like it raises in volume by like double. Because that's like the most active time frame when all the yeast and bacteria and stuff are feeding, and they're just like going crazy and they're doing all their digestion process. It's really fluffy. It's really fluffy. And then after about 12 hours, it starts dying back down. It starts like coming back down the jar. And that's kind of on its descent. And it's like, we're getting hungry again. And so at that point, the sourdough starter is not good for making bread because you need it at its like fullest height and potential of like the fluffiest, greatest potential possible to make good bread. But then like what do you do after it's past that point? So there's some really fun recipes that you can do with the sourdough discard.
So what do you do with your discard?
Yeah.
What do you do with your discard?
Like to make pancakes.
Okay.
It's different than normal pancakes. You have to let it sit for, 8 to 12 hours to ferment. But English muffins are another really fun one.
Okay.
I love that. I don't remember. Those are kind of the ones that I go to.
Okay.
Oh, the other one that I usually do, like I said, pancakes, but I actually just take the straight, like the sourdough discard, and then throw it into a pan with some oil, some butter or something, and cook it on both sides. And it's just kind of a quick little sourdough discard pancake.
Yeah, it's more like a flatbread.
Flatbread. That's what.
But yeah, I do that too. But I don't put oil in my pan. I just use a dry pan.
Oh.
Sprinkle some salt or some herbs on top. So
Sesame seeds, chives, whatever you have.
It's yummy. And then you can like dip that in your soup or whatever you're doing with it. So that's a really quick way to do it. I shared before, if you have chickens, they love eating it plain. So you can dump it in there and they'll just eat
raw?
it. I just dump it straight on the ground and they gobble it up. It's so good.
That's hilarious.
It is funny. And then one thing that I love to do with my discard, like a simple thing rather than like getting out a recipe book and whatever, because there's lots of recipes.
Yeah, there are.
But I like to make crepes for my family.
Right.
So just the discard mixed with eggs.
Cool.
And then you whisk it.
Cool.
Add a teeny water if you need to thin it a little, but usually it's just fine with the discard and the eggs.
That's cool.
And then it makes a really thin batter and you just make a crepe out of that. That one's really fun too.
That's fun because it's like quick and instant, ready to go, right? Those are really fun things.
Yeah, and I think knowing some of these things, having these quick recipes in your back pocket, the flatbread or the crepe recipe, whatever.
Right.
Like so I consider this my fast food.
Yeah, me too.
So when I don't want to cook or I don't have time to cook or I don't know what to cook, or we need to make a meal quickly, rather than going to fast food or ordering pizza or Chinese food, I get out my sourdough and we make crepes, right? Yeah. So it's just as quick and easy to make those than
anything else.
Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, so I think learning some of those fun nuances really makes the sourdough process a lot easier, and then you're not throwing flour down the drain.
Right.
But if you have chickens, don't throw down the drain. Feed it to your chickens. That's a great tip. I did not know that. I don't have chickens, so
they love it.
She's on the chicken bandwagon.
So but the ultimate goal is to make a beautiful big loaf of crusty bread, right? That's the goal.
Yes.
And I believe, in my opinion, this is a skill that people used to have. Yeah. But when you hear about, if you ever read like old stories, the teenage girls from a young age, they were trained on how to make bread in their homes.
Okay.
And I think it's for this reason. Like making bread today is not a really hard process. But making sourdough, the way that they used to make it, and the only way they had to make it back in the day, is challenging, and you really have to figure it out and have somebody show you. It's almost artisanal.
Yeah, I
right?
agree.
So anyway, I just think it's something that it's helpful to practice and to know how to do. But
I know, and that's what I was saying at the kind of sorry, at the beginning, right? It's like I think it just takes a while of practicing, because the first few times of me making sourdough, like I was really committed to this whole process, but I gave it a go for a couple of weeks and I'm like, that didn't turn out very good. So I kind of gave it a rest, and then I circled back to it maybe 6 months later, and kind of it was a little bit better the next time around. It just wasn't amazing, and then I gave it a rest, and then I came back again full circle, and now I'm like, oh, this is amazing. So it's
my first few, first few attempts were very flat loaves.
Mine too. They tasted great, but very flat.
Right.
And that's part of the trick of sourdough, because it's a less, I mean, there's some control once you understand the nuances of sourdough, because it's a living, breathing thing. But it's different than like commercial yeast, because it's it's a lot easier to control a really nice big rise.
Right.
It's like the difference of putting baking powder into something versus not having baking powder, and baking powder guarantees this really nice big fluffy thing. But without it, it's like, how do you accomplish that without that?
Yeah.
And that's what we're trying to figure out.
And I feel like it. There's in the sourdough world, you'll find people that say you have to do it this way,
right?
And you have to do things like this,
right?
But I disagree, and I'm like, it's good to learn some of those tips and tricks, but I believe you can find a way that works for you.
Yes.
That is not necessarily by other people's books.
Yes.
So
yes.
Do you want to talk us through how it works for you?
Yeah, I love that.
Because I shared how it works for me in the other episode, so check that one out.
Yeah, and the way that you described it is kind of more that traditional approach, right? It's like do all these specific, they're not complicated, but very specific steps along the way. And they're great steps in order to learn. Most recently, I found somebody on YouTube, and they shared this really simplified down version of it. And I should have pulled it up before we got on here, but
no, that's okay. We can
post of memory.
We'll post the link to it.
Yeah.
But go up memory.
I think I found it because it was every time I make sourdough, like I don't have a memorized recipe. And so I usually have to like look it up and like find the weights and the measurements and stuff. And so I think that's what I was doing this day. And I just happened across this video and I was like, what? And so I clicked on it and watched it, and it just like simplified the whole process down.
Okay.
And I really loved it, and I had really great results with it. So what Laura was describing in her last video was, you mix it all, like you have to do the water and the flour first, and you have to do what's called an autolyse process, where the flour gets hydrated, and then you add in your sourdough starter and your salt, mix it all together. And then you have to let it sit for 30 minutes, and then you do autolyse?
They call it a stretch and
fold. Thank you. Autolyse is the first part. Stretch and fold, like 4 times, where every half an hour, 20 to 30 minutes, you're like literally stretching the dough on top of itself. And it's the gluten development process. It's like the kneading process that you do with a regular loaf of bread. And you do that like a 2-hour process minimum. I mean, maybe 3 to 4 total from start to finish, and then you have to like calculate in the 12 hours of like your sourdough starter and all this stuff. So it's a lot of timing. And that's great. But, and then from there you have to like ferment your dough. I usually you can do it on your counter, but then I like to do it in the fridge overnight, because then it's like really hands off. The next morning, then I shape it, and then I let it rise a little bit, and then I bake it, right? So it's a little bit of an extensive process, that whole thing. So this video really simplified it down for me, and I really enjoyed it. And he basically said, just mix all your ingredients in at the beginning, right? So like whatever percentage it's flour, water, salt, and sourdough starter. So like mix it all together in the first stage. Like don't separate them out, just mix it. Have it ready to go. Let it sit for 30 minutes. And then from there, like we totally skip all the stretch and folds, which I was like, what? Is this a real thing? So I tried it, and it turned out pretty good without the stretching and folding, which was really cool. So you just let it kind of sit for 30 minutes. And then I think what it does is like the gluten just kind of relaxes. as it sits with the water. Because when water and flour mix together, it actually starts the gluten development.
Okay.
And then the kneading is required to continue that development. But apparently, just simply the next step that he teaches you is just shaping your dough, and just by creating a really nice tight ball that helps the development of the gluten without all the stretching and folding process. Which I thought, okay, this is really cool. So you shape it and then you put it in whatever container you're using for the shaping, the long fermenting process.
Okay.
And then I always cover up my sourdough, the dough, the actual loaf, so there's not any air exposure. And then, so I did that same thing, right? Covered it up and put it in my fridge overnight. And the next morning I baked it, and it turned out pretty good. Like, in the video he shows, I think the video is really entitled like how to do this like for beginners, or how to like not screw up your sourdough or something like that.
Okay.
Just really, really simple. And so he had some really nice simple ways to even bake it in your oven without any fancy equipment, like with no Dutch oven or whatever, just on a baking sheet or what, I don't remember exactly. I think you just use like a glass bowl for one and put a little water in it. So you just use some really cool creative ways. If you're into sourdough, like, I mean, I have a Dutch oven now specifically. I bought a Dutch oven specifically so that I can make sourdough in it. But you're not required to do that apparently. But I always thought that was required because everybody that I've ever seen was like, you have to have these things, and apparently you don't.
Right. And quite honestly, you probably don't have to do a lot of what they say you have to do.
Right.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the recipe you shared, or the process, reminds me of like a traditional kneaded dough where you're like mixing it by hand, versus there's ones all over the internet called overnight artisan bread.
Oh yeah.
And you just like mix it in the bowl.
Yeah.
Let it sit, and then you bake it. Like
that's probably what this is like. Yeah. Cool.
Right. A little more hands off.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah.
No, I think it's like really simplifying the process down, or even the baking process that you were sharing.
Yeah.
Like, I'm pretty sure you can bake a loaf of sourdough just in a straight oven,
right,
without any equipment,
right,
at all, just on a baking pan,
right.
But you probably will get better results if you have some moisture in there and or covering or whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But if you don't have fancy equipment, figure it out without the equipment,
just
right?
It's
okay. Like, really, people have been baking this way for thousands of years, like from the beginning of time, right?
Yes.
Like, this is really all that they had. And so I think back in the day, like, they had an open fire.
Yes.
And they were baking this kind of bread, right?
Exactly. I know, it's like fire. I don't understand how they, but
I think they had better results once they started baking, like creating like an oven shape.
I think so too.
With their stones or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's a whole nother level of sourdoughness,
right? I'm not there yet.
Flame.
When we get there, we'll do another episode on that. On a squirrely note, didn't you say that you have a solar oven, or you wanted to get a solar oven? Do you have one?
No.
Oh, we just were talking about solar ovens at some point in the recent past, and I thought that you had one.
Oh.
And I was like, that would be cool to do a sourdough loaf in a solar oven.
Do have a, you mean like the name
the
brand
sun
is called a sun oven.
Yeah. So it's like an oven, it's a little box with what is it, like a plastic lid?
Yeah, glass or plastic, and it has reflectors.
Yeah, and it like opens up like a big, like, I don't know. It opens up on all four sides, and it has the reflector things, and it pulls in the sun's rays, and it heats up your oven. So a lot of people bake up bread in there, but that would be cool too. You should try that. All right, that's our next level.
Try it, and then we'll talk about that one.
Right. Solar
that did not go well. I know. That's the interesting process, because the sun oven, from what I understand, it takes like 12 hours to cook something that normally takes 1 to 2 hours, because it's a much slower process.
Oh, so it's a little bit better maybe for slow cooking things. Oh,
but it might work really well for sourdough.
Maybe.
Because It could be fermenting while it's slowly cooking. I don't know.
We'll do some research. Now I'm so curious.
But I also know sourdough you typically cook at a pretty high temperature.
Yeah,
so I
you
don't know
do.
how that's going to work in a sun oven. But
Right. So back to like this
Yeah.
whole thing about like, I think the cool thing about learning about something a little bit more in depth, right? At least how I do it, as long as I'm doing it long enough, all of a sudden my awareness, my understanding expands where I'm like, okay, this may be like the normal way that I do it, but I can like, I call it accordioning it down. That may not make sense to you, but like an accordion like can stretch big and go really small, right?
Mhm.
That's the point of this. It's like now I understand sourdough enough that I can keep it in that middle of the road. Like this is the
Mhm.
typical way to do it. You get good results this way, including like the specific varied, I mean not varied, but like the specific temperature ovens. Like I watched a video
Right.
where this guy like literally experimented with all the different ranges of temperature in his oven, this and that and all these things. And he was like, this is what I found is the best. Do it at this exact temperature for this amount of time and then reduce it to this exact temperature for this amount of time. And I was like, whoa, buddy, that's
Mhm.
intense, right?
Yeah, and I think it's okay to learn
Yeah.
those things. And I like
Yeah.
finding experiments,
Me
like
too.
experimenting and like finding out the thing that works the best.
Me too. So
But
you
you
learn.
also, I call them principles,
Yes,
right? So learning principles and
I love that.
trying to stay within the principles is a good thing,
Yes.
even
Yes.
for sourdough.
No, I think that's it. Cause like
Mhm.
there's principles that govern the whole thing, right?
Mhm.
Like you can't make a good, beautiful, lovely, fluffy loaf if your sourdough is not fully activated. Like that's one of the principles, right?
Right.
But your sourdough, we can't give you the exact time on how long your sourdough will take to activate, but
Mhm.
we can teach you the principle. Like when your sourdough is full, your sourdough starter is fully activated. This cool thing happens. Like you take a little spoonful, little like teaspoon or tablespoon of it, put it in some water, and if it floats to the surface and it stays floating, it means it's fully activated, ready to make bread with.
Hmm.
But if it sinks, because I struggled with this for a while, because people would tell me it's like the float test is what they call it.
Hmm.
And if your sourdough is sinking to the bottom, it's not ready for bread.
Hmm.
And so now that I
Interesting.
understand the cool concepts of watching my sourdough starter as it's rising, because you actually it's fully activated when it
Rounds.
Yeah, when it rounds on the very top, because it's like building, and then at the very peak of its height, it like has this roundy bubble on the top. And that's when you know. But if you take some from that place and put it in some water, it just completely floats because it's so full of air. And that's one of the principles.
Okay.
Super cool. Like following percentages, not required, but it's a really good principle to follow because it helps you keep it precise.
Right.
What are some other principles that you've learned along the way?
I would say like learning some of those like lengths of time. I don't know. We've shared some tips before.
Yeah.
I don't feel like there's anything really specific on principles.
Right.
Other than like I have not slashed the tops of my loaves and it bubbles out in the side.
Bulges
so
sometimes, yeah.
that might be a principle if you want a beautiful loaf, right? To
Right.
slash the top.
Right.
To some degree.
Right.
Even if that, like, to me, that I don't have fancy equipment, so I just take a serrated knife and just cut one slash across the top.
And that's perfect because what that does, the principle behind that is it creates an air escape for the bread because there's a lot of air. I mean, there's a lot of liquid in your sourdough bread, and so it allows that steam when it's cooking to come out somewhere. Otherwise, it'll kind of explode like a volcano off to the side.
You just take a risk of having a funky looking loaf at that point. So other than that, I think
those are the principles. Because really it doesn't, in this video that I'm talking about, like he used just regular plain whatever flour. It's like it wasn't any fancy kind of flour, it wasn't high protein flour, it wasn't whatever, it wasn't organic, it wasn't anything.
Right.
So just use what you have and make sure it has gluten in it. I don't know that
you can do it with non-gluten things, but I don't know. I haven't experimented with that. I have a friend who has gotten into that, but I haven't, so I don't know what to tell you on that.
Yeah.
Other than do some research on that and do some practicing, and it's gonna be a different ball game.
Yep. One of the fun things, kind of full circling, right? To like when you make your sourdough loaf, and you're enjoying it, oh my gosh, there's nothing better than like fresh sourdough with like yummy butter on it. Okay. Okay, it's just exciting to me. But one cool fun thing that's different about a sourdough loaf versus just whether you're making a regular loaf of bread with commercial yeast or you're buying one from the store, is that it's strange, but it tends to last a long time. Like it doesn't go bad hardly at all. I've never had a sourdough loaf go bad.
Yeah.
Cool
Natural
process.
Preservatives. I mean, you want to eat it within a certain, like fairly quickly, or put it in the freezer.
Yeah, right.
But
good.
But it can last for a week and a half.
It will
just
dry out.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the problem that I have with it the most. But I've never seen it like mold and go bad. So kind of a cool process. I've seen other breads mold within that same period of time, but not a sourdough. So just some fun things that cool. I get excited about when I talk about sourdough. So anyway, I don't know. Any other thoughts?
No, I think that was a good round two on
round two. I love it. So love to hear your stories about your sourdough experience, or if you're a newbie and you don't know much about it, we'd love to hear about what you learned from our video from today or from our episode. And we'd love to invite you to come join our community. We have a Facebook group, and I forget the name. What is it called?
So the URL to get to the Facebook group, you're going to go to carrotgal.com/chats.
Perfect.
CHATS. And that'll take you to a page, and there'll be a link on there to jump over to the Facebook group. So jump in there, and we love to answer questions in there and to get to know you and to continue the conversation. So,
love it. Okay. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Okay. Talk to you next time. Bye.